She was mocked for her size, overlooked by every man in town. But when his motherless children begged for her to stay, the rancher saw something no one else ever had: a mother's heart. The wagon wheel snapped in two. Rain had started to fall not 2 miles back, and now thunder shook the earth, loud and mean like judgment. Pearl Fletcher sat there in the broken wagon, soaked clear through, cheeks red from the cold wind and something deeper, shame. She tried not to look back at the farmhouse she'd just left. Her trunk sat beside her in the mud like a coffin. Everything she had was inside it: dresses too big, underthings too worn, and the little tin box of thread she used to mend clothes for ladies who wouldn't be seen walking beside her in town. She didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because she was used to it. Pearl had come here by letter. The rancher's mother had written, asking if Pearl would come help with the children. "They need someone steady, warm, and you're good with little ones," the letter had said. "My son's heart is still buried beside his wife's grave." Pearl had come, quiet and hopeful, telling herself she wouldn't expect anything. She'd only stay the month, cook, clean, help where needed, but she'd let herself dream just a little. Maybe the children would laugh. Maybe the house wouldn't feel so cold. Maybe she wouldn't be so alone. But the moment she stepped out the wagon, everything changed. Bo Mathers had opened the cabin door, and the look on his face, Pearl felt it in her marrow. Disappointment. Not anger, not cruelty, just that quiet kind of judgment that cuts deeper than words. "She won't fit at our table," someone had whispered once at church. That same tone echoed now in Bo's silence. His 3 children peeked from behind his legs. Ruth, the oldest, barely 10, a sharp-eyed little girl with too much weight on her shoulders. Then came Will, 7, always clutching his wooden pony, and little Joanna, just 5, wide-eyed and sucking her thumb. Bo had nodded, offered her a room to rest. She stayed the week, cooked their meals, scrubbed the floors, mended Ruth's ripped dress, and sewed patches on Bo's shirts. The children started smiling again. Joanna took to curling up beside Pearl while she read old Bible stories before bed. Will showed her how he liked his cornbread sweet. Even Ruth, stern Ruth, started calling her Miss Pearl instead of the woman. But none of it mattered. That morning Bo had stood at the door, hat in hand. "My mom meant well," he said, "but you shouldn't have come." Pearl didn't ask why. She knew why. She left with her trunk, pulling it alone down the muddy trail, refusing his help. Halfway down the hill the wheel cracked. So now she sat in the rain, too proud to cry, too stubborn to move. But then, "Miss Pearl." A child's voice, then 2, then 3. She turned. Ruth, Will, and Joanna came running through the rain, barefooted, half-dressed. Ruth had tears in her eyes. Will held that pony like a sword. Joanna was crying outright. "Papa didn't mean it," Ruth shouted, panting. "He's just scared. He always gets like that when he misses Mama." Pearl swallowed, her throat burning. "We want you to stay," Will said. Joanna climbed onto her lap, soaking wet, curling into her like a kitten. Pearl looked up. Bo was standing behind them now, his boots sloshing in the mud, his face unreadable. The wind howled again, pushing them all closer together. "I ain't looking for pity," Pearl said to him, barely above a whisper. "I just came to help." "I know," Bo said. He knelt beside her, eyes heavy. "But I've lost one wife. I'm scared to let another woman into this house, not because of you, but because of me." The storm cracked above. Pearl didn't answer. She just held Joanna tighter. Then Ruth stepped forward, standing between Pearl and her father. "Papa," she said, her voice shaking, "please let her stay." Bo's shoulders slumped like a man who just lost a long fight. He didn't speak, but he reached out and took Pearl's trunk in one arm, lifting it from the mud. Then he held out his other hand to her. Pearl hesitated, then took it. They walked back up the hill together. But the real trouble hadn't started yet. It was only days later that Bo's sister rode into the valley, cold and bitter, demanding to know what stranger had moved into her brother's home. "You let her stay," she snapped, looking Pearl up and down. "Is this some charity case, or are you thinking to marry her?" Pearl flinched. Bo said nothing. Then a man showed up. Henry Crowley, slim, sharp-tongued, and full of secrets, said he'd once been sweet on Pearl back in town, claimed she owed him a debt, and if Bo wouldn't send her away, well, he might have to collect it in ways that make everyone uncomfortable. That night Pearl found a note nailed to the barn. "Fat women don't belong here." Bo tore it down with shaking hands. "You don't have to protect me," Pearl whispered. But Bo just looked at her, eyes unreadable again. "I'm not protecting you," he said. "I'm protecting my children, and they've chosen you." Still, the fear in his voice lingered. The shadows around the ranch grew longer, and Pearl couldn't help but wonder what storm was really coming. Pearl rose before the sun the next morning, hands aching from the cold, back still sore from sleeping on the cot in the laundry room. Even though Bo had offered her the guest room, the one no one had entered since his wife passed, Pearl had refused. She hadn't come here to take another woman's place, just to serve quietly. She built the fire and swept the hearth just as she had the mornings before. The cabin still creaked and groaned like it resented waking. Pearl didn't mind. She whispered morning prayers to herself as she worked, asking God for courage not for herself but for the children. They deserved warmth, laughter, a mother's hand on their brow when fever came, a gentle voice when the storms howled. By the time the coffee boiled and the biscuits were browning, little Joanna came padding down the stairs, hair like straw and eyes still heavy with sleep. "Miss Pearl," she whispered, dragging her blanket behind her, "can I sit in your lap again?" Pearl opened her arms without hesitation. "Of course, baby." The child curled against her like they'd done this forever. Pearl rocked her slightly, humming an old hymn under her breath. Will came next, quieter, holding his wooden pony and watching her the way boys did when they were trying not to admit they loved something. "Morning, Mr. Pony," Pearl greeted gently. "Did he sleep all right?" Will nodded. "He had bad dreams." "Well, he's safe now," she said, brushing his bangs from his eyes. And then Ruth came down, trying to look grown, like she hadn't cried herself to sleep. She didn't speak, but she sat at the table and poured herself a cup of coffee she was far too young to drink. Pearl didn't scold, just slid a warm biscuit her way. Ruth blinked down at it. "You made M like Mama did." Pearl smiled. She must have had a good hand with dough. Ruth nodded and looked away, but she didn't push the biscuit aside. Bo came down last, boots heavy. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. Pearl stood to pour him coffee, but he stopped her. "You cooked, cleaned, and stayed up with Joanna after her nightmare. Let me serve you this morning." She blinked at him. He took the pot and poured her cup with a steady hand. It was the first time he looked her full in the face. And it was the first time Pearl saw something soft in his eyes. Not love, not yet. But not shame either. Still, the moment was short-lived. Before breakfast ended, there was a knock at the door, sharp, angry. Bo froze, so did Pearl. Ruth was the one who moved. "It's her, Aunt Clara." Bo stood and opened the door. Clara Mathers was tall and bony, her lips always pressed like she'd bitten a lemon she never spat out. Her black riding gloves gleamed. Her hat was pinned so tight it might have been nailed to her skull. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw Pearl. "So it's true," she snapped. "You've brought in a laundress to mother your children." Bo's jaw tightened. "Clara, she's been a help." "She's a joke, look at her. You're making our name a laughingstock." Pearl stood straighter, but she didn't speak. Ruth stood too. "We like her." Clara glanced at the girl. "You're a child, you don't know what you like." Joanna clung to Pearl's skirts. "She reads us stories," Will said, defiant. Clara's eyes snapped back to Bo. "This isn't about the children. This is about you. You're letting grief turn you into a fool. You think the town won't talk when they see her in your kitchen." "She's not in my kitchen," Bo said, voice low. "She is the kitchen. She made it warm again." Clara's eyes flashed. "You let this continue, Bo, and I'll speak with the pastor. The children should be staying with me, not raised by some fat seamstress who thinks she can play house." Pearl flinched. But Bo didn't. "You take another step toward those kids, Clara, and you'll have more than a pastor to answer to." Clara's face twisted. She turned and stormed off. The door slammed. Silence rang. Pearl looked down at the children, then at Bo. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I don't want to cause more trouble." "You already did," Bo replied. "You woke something in this house that'd been dead for years, and I'm not burying it again." But it wasn't over. Trouble never knocks just once. 2 nights later, someone left a dead chicken on the doorstep. Pearl found it before sunrise, the bird's neck twisted, feathers scattered like a warning. Tied to the claw was a strip of cloth, her own apron ripped in half. Bo cursed under his breath, grabbed his rifle, and scouted the property until dawn. When he came back, he said nothing, but the look in his eyes made Pearl's hands tremble as she cooked. That day, Ruth sat closer than usual. Joanna wouldn't let go of Pearl's skirts. Will asked her to read Psalm 23 3 times in a row. And Bo stood near the window, watching the tree line as if expecting war. That evening he finally spoke. "Crowley," he muttered, "it was him." Pearl nodded. "He said he'd come, I just didn't think he meant it." Bo turned to her. "What's he want from you?" Pearl's hands tightened on her apron. "To make me ashamed. He used to be sweet when we were kids. Said I was kind. Said I laughed too loud, but he liked it. Then he went off, came back bitter. He saw me doing laundry one day and said I looked like I'd swallowed the soap bucket." Bo's face darkened. "And now?" "He wants to make sure no one else sees me different. He liked it when I was invisible." Bo nodded. "He doesn't get that power anymore." That night Bo moved a cot outside the girls' room, rifle at his side. But they didn't need it. Not yet. The next week passed with quiet tension. Pearl kept busy, too busy to think. She scrubbed the floors, repaired the back fence, taught Ruth how to bake without burning the edges, and sang to Joanna while she brushed her hair. Sometimes at night she heard Bo pacing the porch, or whispering prayers. And one morning, just after dawn, Pearl stepped outside and found him asleep on the front step, rifle still across his lap, frost in his beard. He was guarding them. Sorry. But the final blow didn't come from Crowley. It came from someone Pearl never expected. Her own cousin, May. She arrived by coach, big hat, fancy gloves, perfume so strong the air soured. "Pearl," she said sweetly, "you look full." Pearl's breath caught. May grinned, stepped inside like she owned the place. "I heard you de-landed yourself on a ranch. Thought I'd come see what sort of tragedy it was." Ruth frowned. "Who's she?" "Family," Pearl muttered, jaw clenched. May strutted through the kitchen. "Well, I can see you're keeping yourself well fed. Is that the rancher?" She peered out the window where Bo was chopping wood. "He looks sad. Is he widowed?" "Yes," Ruth said, eyes narrowed. "And he don't need you sniffing around." May gasped, hand to chest. "What rude little children." Pearl stepped forward. "Why are you here, May?" "To collect," May said, voice turning sharp. "You remember the money Mama gave you when you left? That was for a seamstress shop, not for playing wife to some grieving farmer. I want it back." "I used it to survive," Pearl said, "to eat, to get here." "Then you owe me." "I owe you nothing." "Then I'll take what you've got left." May's gaze flicked to Bo again. "Looks like that's your only prize." Pearl stepped between her and the window. "Leave." "I will," May said sweetly, "after I tell the whole town your little secret." Pearl's face went pale. "Go on then," Bo said, suddenly behind them. but you won't be welcome back here." May opened her mouth, closed it, then stormed out, muttering curses that made Ruth plug Joanna's ears. After the door slammed shut, Bo turned to Pearl. "What secret?" Pearl hesitated, then whispered, "I was engaged once. He left me before the wedding, said I was too heavy to carry across the threshold. May's always used it to humiliate me." Bo didn't blink. "You carried my whole house this month," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth." Pearl looked at him, and something inside her cracked. Not pain, not shame, but hope. A dangerous, beautiful hope. And as they stood there, the door creaked again. Will stood at the frame, eyes wide. "There's smoke," he whispered. Bo bolted past him. Outside, fire curled at the barn's edges. Someone had set it ablaze. And carved into the door was a single word. "Vat." The barn roared with fire. Flames licked through the dry timber like they were born there, stretching tall and fast, crackling with fury as smoke curled black into the twilight sky. The animals inside screamed. Pearl's heart punched against her ribs. Bo was already sprinting toward the blaze with a bucket in each hand, shouting orders. Will chased after him barefoot. "Stay inside," Bo barked over his shoulder. "Get the girls out back." Pearl didn't waste time asking. She grabbed Joanna in one arm, Ruth in the other, and pushed through the back door into the yard, away from the barn. The ground felt hot under her feet, the wind carrying embers like vengeful birds. The sky had turned an awful orange, as if the sun had decided to stay and watch. Ruth tugged away and ran back toward the well. "We need more water." Pearl hesitated, but then grabbed a bucket herself and followed. Bo was already in the barn's side entrance, coughing through the smoke, flinging open stall doors. 2 of the horses had fled already, but the calf was still inside. Pearl heard its terrified cries and felt something inside her twist. Bo turned, saw her running toward him with Watcher. "Pearl, no, get back." But she didn't stop. She ran straight into the smoke. Inside, the heat wrapped around her like claws. Her apron caught a spark. She tore it off and kept moving. The calf was in the far stall, panicked, eyes wild. Pearl pushed open the gate, grabbed its rope halter, and yanked hard. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "I know you're scared, but I've got you." The calf hesitated, then leapt forward. Pearl let it out just as the roof groaned and something heavy collapsed behind them. Bo was at her side in an instant, grabbing the calf's rope, dragging it into the pasture. "You're insane," he said hoarsely, wiping sweat and soot from her cheeks. "You'd have done the same," she said. He stared at her a long second. "Yeah, I would've." The barn couldn't be saved. By nightfall, it was a smoking skeleton, a black scar on the land. They'd saved the animals, most of the tack, and the children were safe, but the damage was done. Bo stood by the wreckage long after everyone else had gone to bed. Pearl brought him a cup of coffee, warm and shaking in her hand. "Crowley," he said without looking at her. "It had to be." Pearl nodded. "He said he'd ruin me." Bo turned to her, eyes tired. "This ain't just about you anymore. He's messing with my family now." Pearl swallowed hard. "I'm sorry I brought this trouble." "You didn't bring it," Bo said. "You just gave it a reason to show its face. That man's had rotted him for years. I let it fester by staying silent." She looked down. "Maybe I should go after all." Bo stepped closer. "And do what? Let the children think they were wrong to love you. Let him think he won." Pearl couldn't meet his eyes. "He's banking on your shame," Bo said quietly. "Don't give it to him." That night, Pearl tucked the children in again. Joanna wouldn't sleep unless Pearl lay beside her. Ruth had dragged her mattress closer to the door, in case of fire again. Will slept with his hand clutching Pearl's skirt from the floor beside the bed. The next morning, word had spread through the valley. By noon, 3 wagons showed up at the ranch. Each carried women from town. Some had scraps of lumber, others had nails, tools, cloth, whatever they could spare. "You don't know me," one said, a middle-aged woman with a limp and a quiet voice, "but I remember you from church. You helped my girl when she tore her dress last spring. Folks laughed at you, but you didn't laugh back. You just fixed her up and told her she was pretty." Another added, "My boy got sick last winter. You sent over soup and didn't say a word. I never forgot." Pearl blinked in disbelief. Bo stepped forward. "We don't need charity." The first woman smiled. "This ain't charity, Mr. Mathers. This is gratitude." Bo looked at Pearl. Pearl was crying. By dusk, the women had started rebuilding the barn. Bo worked beside them, humbled. Will handed out nails like a clerk. Ruth kept a ledger of supplies. Joanna passed around biscuits. And Pearl was at the center of it all, guiding, directing, smiling even as tears streaked through the soot still on her cheeks. But that night, as the last wagon rolled away, another storm came. A different kind of thunder. Gunfire. It cracked from the tree line. Bo dropped to the ground, pulling Pearl with him. "Stay down." Another shot, then silence. Pearl's heart pounded like it was trying to escape her chest. Ruth screamed from the porch. Will pulled Joanna to the ground. Bo crawled to the fence, eyes squinting into the dark. Then a voice echoed through the trees. "I warned you, Pearl." It was Crowley. "Keep pretending you belong here. You'll see what happens to liars." Then hoofbeats, galloping away. Bo rose, shoulders tense. He turned back toward Pearl, jaw set. "That man won't stop." Pearl stood, voice low. "Then I will." Bo blinked. "What?" "I'm tired of hiding. I've hidden my whole life. In kitchens, behind sewing tables, under big clothes. I told myself I didn't want to be seen, but the truth is I was just scared." Bo stepped closer. "Pearl." "I'm not scared anymore," she said. "I may be too big for ballrooms, too plain for portraits, but I'm not too small to fight." Bo didn't say anything, just pulled her into his arms. And for the first time, Pearl didn't pull away. The next day, they rode into town together. Pearl wore her best dress, the one with the wide sleeves and high collar. She'd never worn it in daylight before. She thought it made her look larger. Today, she didn't care. The saloon fell silent when they entered. Bo marched to the counter. "Where's Crowley?" The bartender swallowed hard. "Ain't been here since last night. Heard he's laying low up by Red Hill." Pearl turned to the room. "Then I'll go to Red Hill." Gasps. Bo blinked. "Pearl." "I'm done being hunted." He saw the steel in her eyes. He nodded. They rode up together. Red Hill was quiet, but the wind told stories. Bo's rifle stayed slung across his back. Pearl rode straight, chin high. They found Crowley's camp by a dead tree. He wasn't alone, 2 men with him, both scruffy, dangerous. But when they saw Bo and the woman at his side, they stood back. Pearl dismounted. Crowley laughed. Well, come to beg." "No," she said, loud and clear. "I came to forgive." He blinked. "What?" "I forgive you, Henry," she said. "Not because you deserve it, but because I do. I won't carry you anymore. Not your insults, not your shame. You tried to make me believe I was unworthy of love. You failed." He stared at her like she was speaking another language. Bo stepped forward. "And if you come near her or my children again, you'll answer to me, and I don't forgive easy." Crowley looked at them both, then laughed bitter and hollow. "You'll regret this," he spat. Pearl smiled sadly. "I regret nothing." And with that they turned and rode home. That night Pearl sat by the fire with Joanna on her lap, Ruth beside her sewing, while drawing stick-figure ponies. Bo stood behind them, arms folded, watching. "You scared?" he asked Pearl. She shook her head. "I was, not anymore." He reached out, brushing a soot smudge from her cheek. "I've never seen anyone braver." She looked up at him. "Bo," she said quietly, "you don't have to say anything. I know I'm not what you pictured. I know folks will talk." "I don't care," he said. "I'm not small, I'm not delicate, I'm not easy to carry." "You carried me," he said, "and them." Then Ruth stood up, walked over and tugged Pearl's sleeve. "If you marry Papa," she said, voice small, "do we get to keep you forever?" Pearl's eyes filled again. Bo knelt beside her. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "but if you'll have us, me, the kids, this land, I reckon I'll do everything I can to be worthy of the way you already love us." Pearl nodded, speechless. Ruth smiled. Joanna clapped. Will ran to get the family Bible. But outside in the dark, hoofbeats stirred again. Crowley wasn't finished. And the danger he'd bring next would test more than just Pearl's strength. It would test the entire town. It began with the smoke. Not thick and wild like before. No, this was sly smoke. Faint tendrils curling up from behind the schoolhouse, too light to alarm the men working the fields, but strong enough to burn the inside of Pearl's nose the moment she stepped out of the butcher's. She'd come to town alone that morning. Not by choice. Bo was out hunting for strayed cattle, and Ruth had a head cold. Pearl hadn't wanted to leave them, but there was no butter, no sugar, and the baby in Joanna's belly was demanding sweet biscuits every morning like clockwork. Yes, baby. 3 years had passed since that stormy night Bo asked her to stay. The wedding came quiet and quick, just them and the children under the tree Bo's late wife had planted. No fancy dress, no preacher from the city, just the land, the sky, and love, real love. Pearl hadn't asked for anything more. But Crowley never did leave. The fire at the barn had been the start. Pearl's public confrontation at Red Hill had scattered him for a while, driven him into the backwoods. But like a thorn, he lodged himself just deep enough to fester. Rumors kept returning, threats scrawled in dirt behind the mercantile, dead rabbits nailed to fence posts, horses spooked in the night. Always no proof, always no name, but Pearl knew. And now the smoke. She didn't hesitate. Basket still in hand, she ran through the alley behind the blacksmith's, skirts gathered, breath tight. That old fear stirred again, not for herself but for the children, the ones at school. She could see them now through the cracked shutters of the classroom, small heads bowed over slates, Miss Annabelle pacing the front with her book. All peaceful, all unaware. But the smoke wasn't coming from the school. It was behind it. Pearl rounded the back and stopped dead. A small fire had been set beneath the water tower. Bundled grass, pine branches, oil. It hadn't caught yet, not truly, but it was placed just right. Another few minutes and the tower might collapse, onto the school. She dropped her basket, yanked her shawl from her shoulders and smothered the flames without a sound. Her hands burned. Her knees hit dirt. She didn't stop until the last wisp of smoke hissed into silence. Then she stood and saw the note, pinned to the wood with a rusty nail. "Next time I aim higher." That night the sheriff rode out. Pearl sat on the porch with her wrapped hands in her lap, Bo beside her. He hadn't spoken since she told him. Just sat there, jaw clenched, eyes on the dark tree line like a soldier waiting for battle. Sheriff Tully shook his head. No witnesses, again, but the way he planned it, that was no prank, that was murder waiting to happen. Bo's voice was gravel. "We know who it was." Tully looked uncomfortable. "I can't just arrest a man on hunches." Pearl spoke quietly. "We don't need you to. We just need to know what happens if he comes again." Tully hesitated, then handed Bo a small tin badge. "Deputize yourself if it comes to that." Bo's grip on the badge was tight. Pearl stood before the fire that night, holding Joanna's hair back as the girl retched from morning sickness. Little Joanna, who still curled into Pearl when nightmares came, now about to be a mother herself. Pearl wiped her face with a cool cloth, whispering prayers. "Will he hurt us?" Joanna whispered. No, Pearl said, not while I breathe. And she meant it. The next day Pearl took a walk, alone on purpose. She went down into the hollow where she knew Crowley drank. The stream gurgled nearby. The sky was still, and there he was, crouched by a stump, sharpening a knife. He looked up and smirked. Look what rolled in. Pearl didn't flinch. It ends today. Crowley stood slowly. That's so. You leave my family alone, she said. You let the past stay buried and we pretend you never existed. Crowley laughed. You think you get to make demands now? Pearl stepped closer. I'm not scared of you. You should be. I was, she said. For years. You used to say no man could ever love someone like me, but Bo loves me more than you've ever been loved in your life. That's what eats at you, isn't it? That someone like me got what you never could. He twitched. I'm not ashamed of my size, she said. It means I've lived. I've carried children through fevers. I've hauled water through snowstorms. I've stood between fire and my family, and still I'm standing. Crowley lunged. She didn't move. He stopped, inches from her face, breathing hard. You wouldn't dare, she whispered. Not here, not now. He held her gaze, then backed off. You'll regret this. I already regret wasting years being afraid of you. She turned and walked away. But she knew this wasn't over. And she was right. That night someone cut the fence line. Half the cattle escaped into the canyon. Bo and Will spent hours chasing them through moonlight, risking cliffs and shadows. One steer broke its leg in the fall. Pearl found Will the next morning, crumpled beneath the oak tree, crying into his hands. I lost one, Mama, I lost one. She knelt, pulled him close. You didn't lose anything, we're still here. But the damage added up. Bo was weary. Ruth had grown sharp-tongued. Joanna's pregnancy was rough, and Pearl bore it all with the quiet strength of a mountain. Until the letters came. Folded into the mailbox, unsigned. Your fat wife's past is crawling back. A real man wouldn't settle for leftovers. She wasn't wanted once, she won't be wanted again. Bo read them aloud with trembling hands. Pearl stayed silent. Then Ruth snapped. This ain't fair, why won't he stop? Bo turned to Pearl. We could leave, start over somewhere new. But Pearl shook her head. And teach the children to run from evil. No, we face it. So they stayed. And then came the Sunday service. Pastor Lyle was halfway through his sermon when the doors creaked. Crowley stepped inside, clean-shaven, wearing a suit. He walked right down the center aisle, slid into the front pew, and turned to stare directly at Pearl. Gasps rippled, whispers started. Pearl sat taller, Bo took her hand. Lyle stammered but continued. Ruth reached for Pearl's other hand. Joanna leaned against her shoulder. Will scowled. But when the sermon ended, Crowley stood and approached the altar. I'd like to speak, he said. Pastor Lyle looked uncertain but nodded. Crowley turned to face the congregation. I've sinned, he said. I was jealous, angry, lost. I took it out on someone who did nothing but live with kindness. I hurt people. Pearl's heart slammed. I don't expect forgiveness, he continued, but I ask for peace. Murmurs now, some nods, others suspicious. He turned to Pearl. I'm sorry. She stared, then nodded. Crowley left. The town buzzed for days. Some said he changed. Some didn't believe it. Pearl kept silent. Bo stayed watchful. Then came the fall fair. Pearl was on the pie committee. Her apple cinnamon crumble was famous now, not for its flavor, but for the woman who made it. Mothers asked for her advice. Widows invited her for tea. Girls with bruised hearts looked to her like she was something holy. And Bo stood beside her like a stone. As the fair peaked, a scream rang out. Fire, fire. The church. Pearl turned, and her blood turned to ice. The church blazed, not the roof, not the doors. The nursery wing, where the youngest children played. Pearl didn't think, she ran. Bo shouted, but she didn't stop. Inside, smoke wrapped around her like old memories. She followed the crying, small, desperate, 3 children, trapped by a fallen beam. Pearl grabbed it, lifted with all she had. Her back screamed, her legs shook. "Come on," she gasped. One by one they crawled free. Then the roof groaned. Bo crashed in behind her, grabbed her arm, dragged her out as the ceiling caved. They tumbled into the dirt. Alive, but barely. The town was stunned. The children were safe. The fire was blamed on a candle. But Pearl knew better. Crowley had made a show of repentance. And now he'd up the stakes. She lay in bed that night, blistered sore, her family all around her. "I'm tired," she whispered. Bo stroked her hand. "You don't have to fight anymore." But Pearl shook her head. "Yes, I do." Because Crowley wasn't after vengeance anymore. He was after everything. And the next move would be his boldest yet. The storm rolled in without rain. Clouds thick and heavy stretched across the sky like bruises, swallowing the late autumn sun. The air turned still, too still, like even the birds were holding their breath. Pearl watched from the porch, one hand on her swollen belly. She was heavy again, heavier than ever, and not just with child. The weight of the past months bore down on her bones like winter coming early. It had been 4 years since that night Bo's children begged her to stay. 4 years since Ruth's eyes softened. 4 years since Will called her Mama without flinching. 4 years since Joanna fell asleep in her lap and whispered, "You smell like home." The world had changed around Pearl Fletcher. The Mathers homestead, once worn and wounded, had bloomed. A new barn stood where the old one burned. A windmill spun gently in the breeze, its slow rhythm steady as Pearl's heartbeat. The farmhouse had fresh white paint, a new roof, and love inside its walls, real, daily, ordinary love. But evil doesn't always die when it's defeated. Sometimes it waits. It hides in shadows, watches from a distance, and plans. Crowley had vanished after the church fire, vanished so thoroughly the sheriff believed him dead. Folks stopped talking, stopped whispering. Some even said Pearl had imagined it all, twisted old stories into fear. But Bo knew better. And so did she. Still, life marched on. Ruth had grown into a sharp, kind young woman, stubborn as Bo, but with Pearl's gentleness. She started teaching the younger children at the schoolhouse twice a week. Will was taller now, voice deepening, always with dirt under his nails from tinkering with the new windmill. Joanna was the heart of the home, sweet, soft, and quick to laugh. Her son Thomas was 2 years old now, clinging to Pearl's apron just like his mother once had. Pearl's own baby was due soon. Bo said she carried him like a mountain carried snow, heavy but beautiful, with something powerful underneath. She laughed when he said it. But part of her worried. Not about the birth, about the quiet. It was too quiet. The first sign came with the pigs. Bo found them early one morning, 3 of them dead and half buried behind the orchard. Not eaten, not stolen, just laid out like a message. Their eyes had been closed with care. Pearl's throat went dry when she saw. Bo didn't say a word. He just buried them one by one. That night he doubled the watch rotation. Will slept with a rifle beside his bed. Ruth sharpened the old knives. Joanna made sure Thomas stayed close at all times. Pearl prayed harder than ever. The next sign came with the dog. Jed had been with them for years. A quiet hound, more ears than bark. He never left Pearl's side when she walked the garden. One morning, he didn't come to her call. Bo found him strung up in the barn, tongue swollen, eyes wide. Nailed to the beam above him was a board. Carved into the wood. Even fat love dies. Bo ripped it down with shaking hands. Pearl didn't speak for the rest of the day. But that night she sat at the dinner table, folded her napkin with slow care and said, "We end this. Now." Joanna whispered, "How?" Pearl met Bo's eyes. "We bait him." Will's fork clattered. "No," Bo said, "not while you're like this." "I've never been stronger," she said, voice calm. "You're 9 months pregnant," he snapped. "I'm a mother," she replied. "I've walked through fire for this family. If I have to walk through wolves, I will." Bo stood and paced. "And if he brings others, if it's more than just him?" "Then we bring more than just us." Pearl's eyes burned with something fierce. "I've spent years proving myself," she said. "Now let the town prove they see me." The plan began the next morning. Pearl wrote a letter, signed it, walked into town with Joanna and Ruth at her side. She posted it outside the church, the saloon, and the general store. "To the one who hides in shadows, I will be in the clearing behind Mathers Hill at sundown, 3 days from now. If you have something to say it to my face. No more hurting animals, no more fires, just you and me. Pearl Mathers." The town buzzed like flies to honey. Some called her brave. Others called her a fool. Pastor Lyle tried to intervene. "You're carrying life, Pearl, don't risk yours." But Pearl only said, "I won't let him poison this town anymore." Then came the waiting. Bo tried to talk her out of it each day, tried logic, fear, pleading. Pearl just kept cooking, sewing, preparing like a woman who knew exactly how her story would go. 3 days later at sundown, Pearl stood in the clearing. Bo was hidden in the tree line, rifle ready. So were 6 other men from town, friends who had once whispered about her, now willing to defend her. The children stayed home. Ruth kissed her mother's forehead and said, "Don't let him make you small." Joanna sobbed and begged her not to go. Will tried to come with her. Pearl hugged them all and whispered, "This is for all of you." Then she waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The sun kissed the hills, wind picked up, trees moaned. And then he stepped out. Crowley. Not the smirking drunk from years before. He was leaner now, face drawn tight, hair gray at the edges, but his eyes were the same wild, spiteful, hollow. Pearl didn't move. He stopped 10 feet away. "I thought you were bluffing," he said. "Didn't think you'd actually show." "I never bluff," she said. "You got the whole town believing your fairy tale," he sneered. "Little fat girl becomes queen, real sweet." "I'm not a girl anymore," she said. He paced. "I could kill you right now," he said. "One swing, done." "You've tried to kill me 100 times already," she replied. "With words, fire, fear, I'm still standing." He stopped. "You think you're brave. I know I am. You stole everything from me." Pearl blinked. "You had nothing to steal. You were already empty." He lunged. But before he reached her, a rifle cracked. A warning shot. Bo stepped from the trees. Behind him, 6 rifles raised. Crowley froze. Bo's voice thundered, "This ends tonight." Crowley's eyes darted. "You'd shoot me for her." Bo didn't answer. Then came footsteps from behind. Ruth, Joanna, Will. All standing at the tree line. Pearl stepped forward. "No more hiding," she said. "You wanted to ruin me because you hate what you see in the mirror, but I am not your mirror. I'm a mother, a wife, a woman loved deeply and truly, and I am done being afraid of you." Crowley trembled. Pearl opened her arms. "Shoot me, cut me, burn my house again, you'll never kill me, because I already won." He stared, then fell to his knees, and sobbed. It was not the ending anyone expected, but it was the one Pearl needed. Crowley was taken into custody. Tried for the fires, the threats, the destruction. Found guilty and sentenced to 20 years. Pearl never spoke of him again. Instead, she gave birth 2 weeks later. A daughter. Bo cried when he held her. "She's got your strength," he whispered. Pearl smiled. "Then she's ready for the world." They named her Grace. And the town threw a feast. Not for the baby. For Pearl. Because in the end, the story wasn't about fear. It was about a woman too fat to be loved, so they thought. But God had other plans. And love. Love had never fit in the neat little boxes people built. It came large, loud, unshakable, and built a home from ashes. Winter came early that year. Snow fell before the leaves had time to finish changing, and the wind snuck through the cracks in the cabin walls with fingers cold as bone. But inside the Mathers home, warmth glowed from every window. Fire crackled in the hearth, the scent of cinnamon clung to the curtains, and children's laughter echoed through the halls. Pearl moved slower now, not from weakness but from fullness. Grace had just turned 1, a round, serious baby with eyes like bows and dimples so deep they seemed carved. She barely cried, preferring instead to observe, to reach for things with deliberate hands. When she smiled, it felt like the world paused. Pearl often sat by the window with Grace in her arms, watching snowflakes gather like silent witnesses. Sometimes she'd hum lullabies, sometimes she'd pray, and sometimes in the stillness her thoughts would drift to what almost was. To the fires, the letters, the man who thought fear could drown love. But every time Grace's small fingers wrapped around hers, every time Ruth walked by with her books, or Will offered a slice of burnt pie he insisted was just well done, or little Thomas tugged her skirt to show a muddy drawing, Pearl remembered what had triumphed. She had not just survived. She had flourished. And yet peace, true peace, often came with shadows just beyond reach. The trial had ended the previous spring. Crowley, sentenced, shackled, taken out of town in a prison wagon. But rumors still stirred in taverns. One whispered that he'd bribed a guard. Another said he'd escaped somewhere south. The sheriff denied it. The papers printed nothing. But Bo kept his rifle closer than ever. And Pearl, she listened to her instincts. Because sometimes, survival sharpens a woman's soul until she feels danger like a splinter in the wind. It was on Christmas Eve that she felt it again. She baked 2 pies for the pastor's family, bundled them in cloth, and set out alone on foot, just a short walk up the hill. Bo offered to come, but Thomas had split his lip roughhousing with Will, and Joanna was trying to sew a last-minute dress for Ruth's Christmas gift. "I'll be fine," Pearl said with a smile, "just a stretch of the legs." Snow crunched beneath her boots, trees leaned with frost. The sky was silver and clean. Her breath came easy. Grace was asleep back at home, bundled beside the fire. It should have been the simplest of errands. But halfway through the wooded trail, she stopped. She didn't hear anything. That was the problem. No birds, no rustling, no wind. Just silence, like the world had paused again, but not for Grace this time. For something else. Pearl turned slowly. And there he was. Not 10 feet behind her. Crowley. He looked thinner, meaner. His coat hung from his shoulders like a shadow. His beard was patchy, but his eyes, those same bitter eyes, had not changed. Pearl's breath caught, her basket tipped. 1 pie fell into the snow. "I warned them," he said, voice like gravel. "I said I'd come back." Pearl didn't move. "You're supposed to be locked away." "I was," he hissed, "but even prison couldn't keep me longer than they kept you. I waited, Pearl. I waited for your fame to die down, for folks to forget, but you just kept getting louder." "I wasn't loud," she said softly. "Love is loud. You married the man who was mine to destroy. You raised his brats. You built a name where mine should have been, and now you think you won." "I didn't win," she whispered. "I endured." He stepped closer. Pearl's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "Let me go home," she said. "No." "Then what?" she asked. "You kill me here on Christmas Eve." "I kill your story," he growled. "I tear down the lie you built." Pearl felt the cold creeping into her chest, not from the snow, from knowing, deep soul deep. This man had crossed a line beyond anger. He was something else now, not just broken, hollow. "You'll never kill it," she said. "Even if you kill me, it's in them now, in Grace, in Ruth, in Will, in Joanna, in Thomas, in the children I read to, in the pies I bake, in the songs I sing. You can end me, Henry, but you'll never end the love I planted." He lunged. Pearl didn't scream. She simply closed her eyes and let go. But the tackle never came. Instead, she heard a thud. When she opened her eyes, Crowley was on the ground, clutching his leg. Bo stood behind him, rifle in hand, breath heaving. "I've had enough of watching you haunt her," he said. Pearl blinked. Then Ruth appeared beside him, face flushed from running. Joanna next, Will behind her. Even little Thomas had followed, still in socks, cheeks red. "We saw you from the window," Ruth said breathlessly. "Thought Mama might need backup," Will added. Crowley groaned. Bo kicked his knife away and looked to Pearl. "You all right?" She nodded slowly. Her hands were shaking. Ruth stepped forward and pulled Pearl into her arms. "He's done now. We're all here." They tied Crowley up and brought him into town. This time there was no trial. The governor's office sent a marshal directly, double sentence, maximum security, transported that same night. Pearl watched the wagon roll away from the sheriff's window, one hand pressed against Grace's back, the other held tight by Bo. And then she let go. The breath she'd been holding for years. The fear. The weight. She let it all go. That Christmas was the warmest they ever had. The whole town showed up to the cabin, not out of pity, out of joy, out of loyalty, out of something Pearl had earned every day of her life, respect. The children sang hymns by lantern light. Pastor Lyle brought fiddle players. The widow Elms made cinnamon cider. Even Sheriff Tully danced once with Joanna and pretended he didn't enjoy it. Bo pulled Pearl into his arms in the middle of the room. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known," he whispered. She looked up at him. "I'm the luckiest," she said. "No," he replied, kissing her forehead. "We are." Years passed. Grace grew. Joanna remarried after Thomas's father died in a distant cattle accident. Ruth opened a schoolhouse in the next county. Will built windmills across the state. But Pearl stayed in that cabin. Bo at her side. Her heart still full. Her love still loud. And though her body slowed, though her hair silvered, her spirit never dimmed. One spring morning, when she was older than she ever dreamed she'd live to be, Pearl sat on the porch with Grace, now 10, beside her. Grace leaned against her shoulder. "Mama." "Yes, baby." "Why don't folks laugh at us like they used to?" Pearl smiled gently, "Because they finally heard our story." "Did we change?" "No," Pearl said, "we just stopped hiding." Grace looked up. "Will I be like you?" Pearl wrapped her in her arms. "No, you'll be better. You'll be bold from the start." They watched the sun rise in silence. The land glowed golden. And somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Not for warning. Not for danger. But for morning. A new day. A life hard one, fully lived, and never once, not once, defined by what others saw on the outside. The harvest came in golden, heavy with promise. Sunlight fell like honey across the hills, and for the first time in years, there were no secrets curling in the shadows, no warnings etched into wood or whispered from the woods. Peace had finally put down roots at the Mathers homestead, and those roots ran deep. Pearl's back ached most days. Her knees popped when she stood, but she moved through the house like a tree moves through the wind, slow but unshakable. Grace was nearly 12 now, and already taller than Joanna had been at that age. She had her father's hands and her mother's heart, which made her as steady as the mountains and twice as kind. Bo had slowed some too. His beard had gone silver at the chin. He didn't lift fence posts the way he used to, and Will, who now ran a nearby ranch of his own, came most weekends to help with the heavier work. But Bo was still the first to rise, still the last to come inside, and still the one Pearl leaned into at night when the fire dimmed and sleep pulled them both into its quiet. It should have been the beginning of the restful years. But peace, as Pearl had learned, is not a thing you possess. It's something you guard. And one morning it slipped. It began with the mail. A single letter arrived from the state capitol. No return name. The paper was thick, formal. Bo brought it in after feeding the chickens. Pearl sat at the kitchen table peeling apples. Grace was scribbling Bible verses in the margins of her copybook. The sun slanted through the window just right, dust motes dancing above the table. Bo didn't speak, just held the letter out. Pearl wiped her hands and unfolded it. Her eyes skimmed the first lines. Then she froze. The letter was from a parole board. Crowley had been transferred months ago. Not to a penitentiary, not to a high-security institution, but to a rehabilitative program for inmates of diminished threat. And now he was up for early release. Pearl's mouth went dry, her vision narrowed. The rest of the words blurred, meaningless in the face of that truth. Crowley wasn't gone. He never had been. Bo's voice broke through the silence. We can protest. Sheriff says he'll write. Pastor Lyle too. Grace looked up. Who's Crowley? Pearl swallowed hard. She hadn't told her yet. Not everything. Not the parts Grace had been too young to remember, too shielded to see. Pearl folded the letter carefully. A man who tried to scare me out of being who I was. Did it work? Pearl looked into her daughter's eyes and said the truest thing she'd ever spoken. No. Still the unease returned. Not panic, not the trembling fear of years past, but a quiet dread like wind through a broken window you thought you defixed. For the next few days, Pearl moved slower. She walked the perimeter of the homestead in the early hours, making sure the gates latched, the doors held, the barn locked. Bo didn't question it. He just walked beside her. I don't think he'll come, he said softly one evening. Pearl nodded. I hope he doesn't, but if he does, I want him to find us strong. The parole didn't go through. The sheriff wired with the news 2 weeks later. Request denied. Inmate remains under watch, the telegram read. Pearl didn't cry, didn't celebrate. She just exhaled and held Bo's hand tighter that night. But even denied freedom has a way of reaching beyond prison walls. Because 2 days later, Pearl received a second letter. This one handwritten. The ink blotched in places, the letters sharp and pressed like they'd been carved instead of written. It said only this: even from behind bars, I can still reach you. Pearl burned it. But the message sank into her bones. That night she couldn't sleep. The room felt too quiet. Even Grace's soft breathing in the next room couldn't still her. She stepped outside and walked to the porch, wrapping her shawl tight. The stars blinked down like curious eyes. The trees were black cutouts against a navy sky. The land had never felt more alive or more watching. And then she heard it. A creak from the barn. Too deliberate. Not wind. She turned fast, heart thudding, but Bo was already there, rifle in hand, eyes alert. They walked together, slow and careful, to the barn door. Bo opened it with a shove. Inside was empty. A young man, no more than 19, lean, pale, eyes the same shade of dark as Crowley's. He introduced himself at the church potluck. Pearl had brought her cornbread. Grace was helping set the tables. Joanna was inside with Thomas and her new baby. Ruth was holding hands with her fiancé, a quiet veterinarian from the next town. The young man approached with a stiff gait and a too familiar gaze. "You're Pearl Mathers?" he asked. Pearl nodded slowly. "I'm Ethan, Henry Crowley's son." The world tilted. She didn't speak. Bo stepped beside her. The scars, the triumphs, the love, and the grace that had saved her. When she finished, she signed it simply. "Your father never knew love, but you still can." "Pearl Mathers," Grace asked one evening as they sat watching the fire, "Mama, do you still feel afraid sometimes?" Pearl looked at her. "Yes." Grace tilted her head. "Even now?" Pearl nodded. "But fear doesn't mean we're weak. It just means we have something worth protecting." Bo reached over and took her hand. And Grace smiled. Outside, the snow began to fall again. But inside, the fire burned steady. Spring came like a hymn whispered through the valley, soft, slow, but carrying the weight of 1,000 prayers. Snow melted into the thirsty ground. Wildflowers burst from the earth like forgiveness, and the Mathers ranch stirred once more with the quiet rhythm of rebirth. Pearl stood at the edge of the field, both hands resting atop her cane, eyes turned toward the hills where she had once been left in the rain with a broken wagon and a trunk full of loneliness. That girl, she barely remembered her. Not because the wounds had faded, but because love had layered itself so thickly over them, not to hide them, but to carry them. She felt the wind brush her cheeks and thought of Grace. 14 now, all long limbs and honest eyes, quiet strength and fierce loyalty. A girl who asked questions deeper than her years and carried herself like someone who had seen the edge of sorrow but never fallen in. Pearl had never taught Grace to be loud or beautiful or dainty. She had taught her to be real, to know the worth of her voice, to listen when it was hard, to walk with her head high when others lowered theirs. That morning, Grace had asked the question again. "Mama, do you think he ever changed?" Pearl hadn't needed to ask who she meant. She looked at her daughter then and replied the only way she knew how. "He doesn't get to shape our story anymore. Whether he changed or not, that's between him and the Lord." Grace had nodded, satisfied. Because in this house, Grace wasn't just a name, it was a way of life. Inside the cabin, the kitchen smelled of fresh bread. Ruth was visiting, her hands dusted with flour, humming the same hymn Pearl once hummed to Joanna when the child cried herself to sleep in her arms. Joanna sat by the fire nursing her third baby, her husband reading beside her. Will leaned against the doorframe, teasing Ruth about her crusts being too thick. Laughter danced between them like a guest who never wanted to leave. Bo was outside, fixing a fence post with Thomas. He was slower now, careful with his steps, but his eyes had never lost their sharpness. When he saw Pearl watching him, he touched the brim of his hat with that same small smile that had first cracked through his grief so many years ago. It was a good day. But Pearl's heart knew something that the others didn't. Something she had been carrying alone. A letter. Not from Crowley. From the prison warden. Months ago. The man who had once haunted their lives had died in his cell, quietly, without ceremony. Heart stopped in his sleep. No visitors, no final words, just a name on a ledger and a body buried by strangers. The letter had sat untouched for weeks. Pearl read it one night by candlelight, Bo asleep beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't rejoice. She only whispered, "Amen." She never told the children. Not because they didn't deserve to know, but because he didn't deserve to be remembered with fanfare. His legacy had ended in silence. Hers, however, had not. It lived in every corner of that ranch. in the walls that now bore hand-carved scriptures Grace etched when she was 10. In the rocking chair by the hearth, where Pearl had comforted every grandchild through fever or storm. In the old photograph above the mantel, Pearl, Bo, Ruth, Will, Joanna, and Grace, taken the day of the town's centennial, where the mayor had asked Pearl to speak and the crowd had wept. That summer the town renamed the schoolhouse, the Pearl Mathers School for Courage and Compassion. She cried then, not for herself, but for every woman who had ever been told she was too much or not enough, too big to be loved, too loud to be wanted, too different to belong. Pearl stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse on dedication day, children running across the grass, mothers standing shoulder to shoulder with her, and she thought about that first week in Bo's cabin, how she'd cooked in silence, tiptoed through rooms, braced herself for rejection. And now here she was, the pillar they built around. She walked slowly through the school's halls, brushing her hand across the polished walls. She passed a display near the entrance, letters from students, old recipes she'd written out, scraps of patchwork from the quilt she and Grace had stitched during one long winter. And beside it all a plaque. To the woman who showed us strength doesn't whisper, it sings. She leaned on her cane, read it twice, and let herself cry. Years passed again. Time took from her body what it never could from her spirit. She grew slower still, her hair silver and thin, but her voice never lost its warmth. Bo went first. Peacefully. On a clear day in late autumn, he sat down under the tree where they were married, Bible in his lap, and never rose again. They found him smiling. Pearl mourned him not with wailing but with the same steadfast grace she gave everything else. She wore his old shirt for weeks, slept with it folded beneath her head, and when she finally let it go, she did so by giving it to Grace's firstborn, stitched into a blanket. One spring morning, many years later, Pearl sat on the same porch where it all began. She was 93. Grace was grown, her own daughter beside her, bouncing a baby on her hip. Joanna's children had spread across 3 counties. Will was a grandfather. Ruth had passed on the school to a bright-eyed girl who'd once been her student. The world had turned, changed. But the cabin remained. Still warm. Still full. Grace sat beside her. "Mama," she said, "do you ever regret anything?" Pearl thought long and deep. The breeze stirred her shawl. The sky above was wide, and the mountains whispered like old friends. "I regret the years I believed them," she said. "The ones who told me I wasn't enough. That love was for others. That kindness was a currency I couldn't afford." Grace took her hand. "But I don't regret staying," Pearl added softly. "Not one single day after I did." And then, with a smile gentle as sunrise, Pearl leaned back in her chair, eyes on the hills, and closed them. Not in pain, not in fear, but in peace. Surrounded by every name she'd carried, every soul she'd mended, every heart she'd made a home for. Her story didn't end in loneliness. It ended in love. And far beyond the cabin, across the fields and valleys and years, her voice still echoed. "I am not too fat to be loved. I am exactly enough to raise generations in love."